The first time I heard my daughter call another man dad, it wasn't in person. It was through a recording my lawyer slid across a polished oak table in a quiet office in Greenwich, Connecticut. And in that moment, I realized I'd already lost something no court could ever give back. My name is Carter Whitfield. I used to believe that truth had weight in a courtroom, that if you stayed calm, stayed honest, and followed the rules, things would eventually fall into place. But divorce has a way of rewriting what you think you know about fairness. Elena Whitfield and I had been married for 8 years. We lived in a modest but beautiful home near Riverside, surrounded by the kind of quiet wealth that never needed to announce itself. We had one daughter, Isla Whitfield. She was 6 when everything started to fall apart. The separation itself wasn't explosive. There were no screaming matches, no broken glass, no dramatic exits. Just a slow, steady erosion of respect that eventually made staying together feel heavier than leaving. But what followed the divorce was not quiet. It was strategic, and it was devastating. Elena filed for primary custody before I even realized she had hired an attorney. Her legal team was aggressive, precise, and disturbingly confident. At first, I assumed it was standard posturing, until I read the allegations. They weren't misunderstandings. They weren't exaggerations. They were fabrications. Claims that I had an unstable temper. Suggestions that I created an unsafe, emotional environment. Implications that Isla felt fear around me. I remember sitting in my lawyer's office, staring at the documents like they belonged to someone else. Because the man they described wasn't me. But somehow, that didn't seem to matter. The first hearing felt surreal. Elena sat across from me, composed and distant, as if we had never shared a life. As if I was a stranger she had carefully prepared to defeat. Her testimony was controlled, measured, believable. That was the part that unsettled me the most. Not the content, but the delivery. When the judge granted her temporary primary custody and limited my visitation, it felt like something inside me collapsed quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Because I knew that temporary decisions have a way of becoming permanent if you don't fight back fast enough. But fighting back wasn't simple. Every interaction had to be documented. Every word had to be filtered. Every reaction had to be controlled. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was performing stability under a microscope. Weeks turned into months. My time with Isla became supervised visits in sterile rooms with neutral observers taking notes. I watched my own daughter hesitate before hugging me. Not because she didn't love me, but because someone had taught her to be careful. And that hesitation cut deeper than any accusation ever could. Before we go further, I want you to think about this for a second. If someone slowly rewrote your child's perception of you, would you fight harder, or would you start to doubt yourself too? Because I started to doubt, not my actions, but my ability to prove them. The turning point came unexpectedly. Not from me, not from my lawyer, but from someone Elena didn't anticipate. Her former assistant, Sloan Harrington. Sloan had worked closely with Elena for years in her interior design firm. She knew her schedules, her habits, her conversations, and more importantly, she knew what was said behind closed doors. She reached out quietly. At first, I thought it was a mistake. People don't just step into custody disputes voluntarily, especially not against someone like Elena. But Sloan wasn't motivated by loyalty. She was motivated by something more complicated. Guilt. She told us about conversations Elena had regarding the custody case. How she had strategized to create a narrative. How she believed emotional perception mattered more than factual accuracy. At first, it sounded like hearsay, but then Sloan provided something else. Documentation. Emails. Voice notes. Fragments of conversations that painted a very different picture than what had been presented in court. One recording in particular changed everything. It was Elena, speaking casually, almost carelessly, explaining how positioning me as emotionally volatile would anchor the judge's concern. There was no anger in her voice. No desesperación, just calculated certainty. When my lawyer played it for me, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow, because hearing the truth didn't undo what had already happened. But legally it mattered. We filed a motion to reopen key elements of the custody ruling. This time, the courtroom felt different. Not because the space had changed, but because the power dynamic had. Elena's confidence was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. There was a tension in her posture that hadn't existed before. When the evidence was introduced, the shift was immediate. The judge didn't interrupt, didn't react outwardly, but you could feel the atmosphere tighten. And then came the questions. Not to me, to Elena, carefully worded, deliberately paced, but unmistakably pointed. For the first time since this began, she hesitated. And that hesitation spoke louder than any argument I could have made. The ruling wasn't immediate. The court adjourned, and we were told to return the following week. That week felt longer than the entire case combined. I didn't know what to expect. Not really, because even with evidence, outcomes aren't guaranteed. When we returned, the courtroom was quieter than usual. Not physically quieter, but emotionally heavier. The judge reviewed the findings methodically. No teatrics, no emotional statements, just facts. Misrepresentation of character, questionable credibility, intentional distortion of narrative. Each phrase landed with a weight I couldn't fully process in real time. And then came the part one never expected. The judge didn't just adjust custody. He addressed something deeper. He spoke about the responsibility of shaping a child's perception of a parent, about how influence, when misused, becomes a form of harm that isn't always visible but is deeply impactful. He didn't accuse Elena directly of malice, but he didn't excuse her actions either. Custody was modified significantly. I was granted equal parenting time, unsupervised, but that wasn't the moment that stayed with me. It was what he said after. He looked directly at both of us and said that the court can redistribute time, but it cannot repair trust, and that rebuilding that would depend entirely on what we chose to do next. Second question for you. If you finally got justice, but it came after damage was already done, would it feel like a win? Because I didn't feel like I had one. I felt like I had been given a second chance, with a child who had already been taught to question me. The first unsupervised weekend with Isla was careful. She was polite, warm even, but cautious in a way that didn't belong to a 7-year-old. We went to the park we used to visit before everything changed. She held my hand, but not tightly, like she was still deciding something. And I realized something then. This wasn't about proving Elena wrong anymore. It was about showing Isla who I actually was. Not through arguments, not through explanations, but through consistency. Quiet, steady presence. No courtroom can enforce that. No ruling can guarantee it. That part had always been mine to earn. And maybe in a strange way, it always would be. Because truth, in the end, isn't what gets said the loudest. It's what gets lived the longest.